drive from Pittsburgh takes 11 hours if you push it, 13 if you stop for food and gas like a normal person. I always pushed it. Something about crossing that invisible line where Pennsylvania becomes Ohio, becomes Indiana, becomes Illinois. You feel the land opening up around you, the hills flattening out, the sky getting bigger. By the time I hit Missouri, the Mississippi was calling to me the way it always had. That ancient brown snake of a river that had been the backdrop to every good memory of my childhood. I'm Tobias Thornwood, though nobody's called me anything but Toby since I was 6 years old. I work construction in Pittsburgh, or I did back then. 34 years old, never married, no kids, living in a studio apartment that I kept so clean you could eat off the bathroom floor. My therapist, back when I still saw one, said I had attachment issues stemming from early childhood trauma. I think I just never found anyone worth attaching to. My parents died in a car accident when I was 4, a drunk driver crossing the center line on Route 61. I don't remember them much, just the smell of my mother's perfume, something floral, and the way my father's laugh sounded like gravel in a coffee can. Grandfather Earl raised me after that, took me in without a second thought, even though he was already 60 years old and had been a bachelor his whole life. The tobacco farm had been in the Thornwood family for 4 generations, and Earl worked it alone until I was old enough to help. Those years taught me everything worth knowing. How to read weather in the clouds, how to cure tobacco leaves until they turned the color of good whiskey, how to fish the Mississippi at dawn when the catfish were hungry and the world was so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. I left for Pittsburgh when I was 22, chasing something I still can't name. Maybe I just needed to see if I could survive without the river, without Earl's quiet wisdom, without the rhythm of farm life. Turns out I could, but it never felt like living. More like waiting. Every October I came back. That was the deal I'd made with myself, the one promise I never broke. October meant the final tobacco harvest, the leaves, fat and golden, ready for the curing barns. It meant fishing the river at dawn, just me and Earl in his old aluminum John boat, pulling in channel cats and blue cats until our arms ached. It meant sitting on the porch after dark, drinking the cheap whiskey Earl preferred, watching the running lights of barges sliding past on the black water. Those visits were sacred to me in a way I never told anyone. The guys on my construction crew didn't understand why I burned every vacation day on a tobacco farm in the middle of nowhere. My few friends in Pittsburgh, acquaintances really, stopped inviting me to Halloween parties years ago. October belonged to Earl, to the farm, to the river. Nothing could change that. But that year, October 2019, something had already changed. The phone calls started getting strange in late September. Earl wasn't a talker, never had been, but our Sunday night check-ins usually followed a comfortable pattern. How's the weather? How's the crop? How's your back holding up? Simple questions, simple answers. The kind of conversation that's really just 2 people saying, "I love you," without having to say the words. "Something wrong with the bottomland," Earl said on the 3rd Sunday of September. His voice sounded different, and it took me a moment to identify the emotion underneath his usual gruffness. Fear. Earl Thornwood, who had survived Korea, who had once fought off a copperhead with nothing but a shovel, who had buried his only son and raised his grandson without ever shedding a tear in front of me. Earl sounded afraid. What do you mean? I asked. Flooding? Crop disease? A long pause. I could hear him breathing, could almost see him standing in the kitchen by the old rotary phone, looking out the window toward the river. Ain't nothing I can explain on the phone. You just come on down when you can. Sooner's better. Earl, if something's wrong, I can drive down this weekend. No, he said, too quick, too sharp. Not yet. Wait till October like always. Just be ready to stay a while. He wouldn't elaborate, no matter how I pressed. The conversation ended with him saying the Riverman came back, and then hanging up before I could ask what the hell that meant. I sat in my apartment for an hour afterward, the phone still warm in my hand, trying to remember if I'd ever heard Earl use that term before. The Riverman. It sounded like something out of the old stories he used to tell me as a kid, the folk tales his grandmother had passed down, warnings about the things that lived in the river's deep channels and the dark hollows of the Missouri hills. I'd always assumed they were just stories. The drive down that first Friday of October felt longer than usual. I left Pittsburgh at 4 a.m, the city still asleep under a haze of streetlights, and by the time I crossed the Mississippi on the old bridge outside Chester, Illinois, the sun was setting behind me. The river looked wrong. I noticed it immediately, though I couldn't have told you what exactly was different. The water seemed thicker somehow, darker, and the normal traffic of barges and towboats was nowhere to be seen. The bridge felt endless, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, fighting an irrational urge to turn around and drive back the way I'd come. Stupid, I told myself. You're being stupid. It's just the river. It's just home. Earl's farm sat on a bend in the Mississippi about 15 miles south of Chester, accessible only by a gravel road that wound through bottomland forest before opening up to 60 acres of tobacco fields and pasture. The farmhouse was a Victorian relic, 3 stories of weathered clapboard that had been white once and was now the gray of old bones. Earl had never seen the point in painting it, and honestly, neither had I. The house had character. It had survived floods and storms and 100 years of Missouri weather. A little peeling paint wasn't going to hurt it. I pulled into the yard just as the last light faded from the sky, my old pirate's cap pulled low against the glare, and that's when I noticed the first wrong thing. The dogs were gone. Earl had 4 dogs, all mutts, all rescues, all fiercely loyal to the old man who fed them table scraps and let them sleep on the porch. There was Big Jim, a black lab mix with one clouded eye. There was Duchess, a hound of some indeterminate breed, who bayed at the moon every night like clockwork. There were the twins, Pete and Repeat, some kind of shepherd something that Earl had found as puppies abandoned by the roadside. Those dogs had been on the farm as long as I could remember, and they always came running when they heard a car on the gravel road. Always. Not that night. The porch was empty. The yard was empty. The silence felt physical, like a weight pressing against my chest. I climbed out of the truck and stood there for a long moment listening. No barking, no frogs singing from the slough behind the tobacco barn, no owls calling from the cottonwoods by the river, no coyotes yipping in the distance. Just silence, deep and wrong and heavy. "Earl?" I called out, and my voice sounded strange in that stillness, too loud and too small at the same time. The screen door creaked open, and there he was, my grandfather, 83 years old, leaning on the cane he'd started using 2 years ago when his hip went bad. He looked older than he had in August, when I'd made a quick trip down for his birthday. His face had new lines in it, and his eyes had something in them I'd never seen before. That fear again. The same fear I'd heard in his voice on the phone. "You made good time," he said. "Come on inside, I made stew." We ate in near silence, the way we often did, but this silence was different. Usually our quiet was comfortable, companionable. Two people who knew each other so well that words weren't always necessary. This was something else. This was the silence of things unsaid, of questions I was afraid to ask and answers Earl was afraid to give. Finally, I set down my spoon. "Where are the dogs, Earl?" He didn't look up from his bowl. "Gone." "What do you mean gone? Did they run off? Did something happen to them?" "They ran off." He was still staring at his stew, and I could see his hands trembling slightly where they rested on the table. 3 nights ago, all 4 of them, same time. I heard them barking fit to raise the dead, and then they just stopped. By the time I got to the porch, they were running toward the river, all of them together, like something was calling them. A cold finger traced down my spine. "Did you look for them?" Looked in the daylight. Found their collars down by the riverbank, all 4, just laying there in the mud. No bodies, no blood, no tracks except... He trailed off, shook his head. "Never mind." No tracks except what? Earl finally looked up at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my stomach clench. He was terrified. This man who had never been afraid of anything in his entire life. "There's things I ain't told you, boy. Things I should have told you years ago. But I hoped it was done. That it wouldn't never come back. 60 years since the last time, and I let myself believe." He stopped, rubbed a hand over his face, and I could see how exhausted he was, how scared. "The Riverman," I said. "You mentioned that on the phone." "What is it, Earl? Some kind of local legend?" "Ain't just a legend. I saw it. Summer of 1959, I was 23 years old, and I saw it clear as I'm seeing you now. My daddy saw it too, back in 1922. Said his daddy saw it before that. Something old, Toby. Something that was here before the farms, before the settlers, maybe before the river itself. It stays away for decades, sometimes generations. But it always comes back." I wanted to dismiss this, wanted to chalk it up to an old man's fading mind, to isolation and age and the kind of superstition that clings to rural communities like moss on a stone. But Earl wasn't a superstitious man. He'd raised me to think critically, to trust what I could see and touch and prove. For him to be talking like this, something real had happened. Something had scared him badly enough to shake the foundations of everything I thought I knew about my grandfather. "Okay," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Let's say there's something out there. What exactly did you see back in 59? But Earl just shook his head. "Not tonight. I'm too tired tonight. And you just got in. Tomorrow. We'll talk tomorrow in the daylight. Ain't nothing going to happen tonight anyway. It don't come close to the house. Not yet." I didn't sleep well that first night. The guest room on the 2nd floor had the same old iron bedstead, the same faded quilt that smelled of cedar and mothballs, the same view of the tobacco fields sloping down toward the river. But nothing felt the same. Every creak of the old house made me tense. Every shift of wind through the cottonwoods outside sounded like footsteps. And that silence, that terrible, unnatural silence, pressed against the windows like something trying to get in. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and walked to the window. The moon was waxing gibbous a few days from full, painting the fields in shades of silver and shadow. The river was a black ribbon beyond the trees, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Nothing moved. Nothing at all. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself that Earl was old, that his mind was playing tricks on him, that the dogs had probably been spooked by a bear or a pack of coyotes and run off. Tomorrow I would search for them properly. Tomorrow I would find a rational explanation for all of this. But standing at that window, staring out at the fields where I'd played as a child, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was staring back. The next morning I drove down to the riverbank where Earl said he'd found the dogs' collars. It was a spot I knew well. A little stretch of mud beach where the Mississippi curved around the farm where Earl and I had launched his John boat 100 times over the years. The collars were gone now, presumably picked up by Earl, but I could see where they'd been. 4 small depressions in the dried mud, arranged in a rough semicircle. I started walking along the bank, looking for any sign of the dogs. Paw prints, fur caught on branches, anything. What I found instead made me stop cold. Tracks. Big tracks. Canine, definitely. The shape of the pads, the claw marks at the toe end, all pointed to some kind of dog or wolf. But the size was wrong. These prints were easily 6 inches across, bigger than any dog I'd ever seen, bigger than a wolf even. And the stride between them. I crouched down, measuring with my hands. 24 inches between prints at least. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that every few yards, the tracks changed. The 4-footed gait would suddenly become 2-footed, the prints deeper and closer together, as if whatever made them had risen up on its hind legs and started walking like a man. I'm a rational person. I've never believed in ghosts or monsters or anything that couldn't be explained by science and common sense. But standing there on that muddy riverbank, looking at those tracks, I felt something ancient and primal stir in my chest. Fear, yes, but something else too. The terrified knowledge that the world was bigger and stranger than I'd ever imagined. That there were things in the darkness that didn't care about science or common sense or anything I thought I understood about reality. I told myself it was a hoax. Had to be. Some local kids messing with Earl, maybe? Using some kind of fake tracks to scare the old man? It was the only explanation that made sense. I held on to that explanation, like a drowning man holds onto a rope, even as something deep inside me knew it was a lie. I followed the tracks into the bottomland forest, the stretch of wild woods that's between the farm and the river that had never been cleared. The underbrush was thick with autumn deadfall, but I could still make out the trail. Broken branches, disturbed leaves. More of those impossible tracks pressed into the soft earth. Whatever had made them was heavy. Very heavy. After maybe a quarter mile, I came to a small clearing where an old oak tree had fallen years ago, creating a gap in the canopy. The sunlight here was brighter, illuminating what I found in the center of the clearing with terrible clarity. Bones. A pile of bones, stripped clean and white, stacked in a mound almost 3 feet high. I could see dog skulls in the pile, 4 of them small and canine, with elongated snouts and empty eye sockets. Big Jim, Duchess, Pete, and Repeat, my grandfather's dogs, reduced to nothing but clean white bones. But that wasn't all. Mixed in with the dog bones were larger ones, the vertebrae of something much bigger, a deer maybe, and what looked horribly like a human rib cage. And on top of the whole pile, arranged with what seemed like deliberate care, was a single item that made my blood run cold. A collar. Not a dog collar. A regular belt, the kind a person would wear, made of brown leather with a plain silver buckle. There was something carved into the leather, and I had to step closer to read it. Henderson, it said. J. Henderson. I pulled out my phone and called the county sheriff's office. The dispatcher sounded bored until I mentioned the bones and the belt. Then her voice got very sharp and she told me to stay right where I was and not touch anything. 20 minutes later, a deputy named Carver came crashing through the underbrush, his hand on his weapon, his face pale beneath his tan. Jesus Christ, he said when he saw the pile. Jesus H. Christ. I showed him the tracks, explained about my grandfather's dogs, told him everything except Earl's stories about the Riverman. He listened with the expression of a man who's seen too much to be shocked but is still plenty disturbed. When I finished, he pulled out a notebook and started writing. Jimmy Henderson, he said after a while. Went missing 6 weeks ago. Wife said he went out catfishing one night, never came home. We searched for days, never found him. He looked at the belt, at the bones beneath it. Guess we found him now. What do you think did this? I asked. A bear? Wolves? Carver looked at me for a long moment, and something in his eyes made me think he knew more than he was saying. There ain't been wolves in this part of Missouri for 100 years, and bears don't stack bones like that. Bears don't. He shook his head. I don't know what did this, Mr. Thornwood, but I'll tell you what I told your grandfather when he called about his dogs. Be careful. Stay inside at night. And if you see anything strange, you call us right away. I wanted to ask him about the other farms, the ones Earl had mentioned with missing livestock. I wanted to ask if anyone else had seen those impossible tracks, those prints that changed from 4 feet to 2. But something in his face told me he wouldn't answer or couldn't or didn't want to. So I just nodded and walked back to my truck, leaving the deputy alone with the bones. That night I tried to get Earl to talk more about what he'd seen in 1959, but he just shook his head and stared out the window at the darkening fields. Tomorrow, he said again, in the daylight. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the discovery and the weight of questions without answers. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those bones piled in the clearing. Saw those tracks changing from 4 feet to 2, saw the empty eyes of my grandfather's dogs, staring at nothing from their clean white skulls. Around midnight, I heard something. It started as a rustling in the brush beyond the yard, barely audible through the closed window. Then it grew louder, closer, and I realized it wasn't rustling at all. It was footsteps. Heavy footsteps, moving through the dead leaves with a slow, deliberate pace. I got out of bed and went to the window, moving slowly, trying not to make any noise. The moon was hidden behind clouds now, but there was enough ambient light to see the tree line at the edge of the yard, the dark mass of the cottonwoods, the silver ribbon of the river beyond. And there, at the edge of the trees, I saw eyes. They reflected the faint light with an amber gold gleam, the way a cat's eyes reflect headlights on a dark road. But these weren't at the height of a cat or a dog or even a deer. They were at shoulder height on a standing man, maybe 5.5 feet off the ground. And the spacing was wrong. Too wide apart, set in a head that was far too big. I stopped breathing. I couldn't have moved if I'd wanted to. The eyes didn't blink. They just stared at the house, stared at my window, stared at me with an intensity that felt like physical pressure against my skin. I could feel them looking at me, looking through me, taking my measure like a predator sizing up its prey. We stood like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then a barge horn sounded from somewhere upriver, long and mournful in the darkness, and the eyes vanished. One moment they were there, fixed on my window with that terrible golden gleam. The next moment there was only darkness, and the slow sway of branches in a wind I couldn't feel. I stood at that window until dawn, watching the tree line, waiting for the eyes to return. They didn't, but I knew they would. I didn't sleep. Couldn't have, even if I'd wanted to. Every time I blinked, I saw those eyes. That terrible amber gold gleam fixed on my window with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept across the tobacco fields, I'd worn a path in the old hardwood floor from the window to the door and back again, my bare feet moving of their own accord, while my mind raced in circles that led nowhere good. Rational explanations. That's what I needed. That's what I kept telling myself as I watched the darkness fade and the world take shape outside my window. There had to be a rational explanation for what I'd seen, for those eyes that were too high and too wide and too knowing. A bear, maybe. Black bears had been spotted in the Missouri hills, and occasionally one wandered down toward the river bottoms. They could stand upright, couldn't they? That would explain the height. And their eyes reflected light, just like a cat's or a dog's. But even as I assembled this explanation in my mind, something deeper rejected it. I'd seen bears before, at the zoo in Pittsburgh, and once in the wild during a camping trip in Pennsylvania. Their eyes didn't glow like that, and their gaze didn't carry that weight, that sense of being measured and found wanting. A person, then. Someone wearing some kind of reflective goggles, playing a sick joke on an old man and his city slicker grandson. That made more sense, didn't it? Rural areas attracted their share of weirdos and pranksters. Maybe some local kids had heard Earl's stories about the Riverman and decided to give him a scare. Maybe they'd found some way to fake those tracks. Those impossible tracks that changed from 4 feet to 2. I held on to this explanation like a lifeline as I finally left my room and made my way downstairs. Earl was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, staring out the window toward the river. He looked like he hadn't slept either. "Saw something last night," I said, pouring myself a cup from the pot on the stove. The coffee was hours old and bitter as regret, but I drank it anyway. "Eyes in the tree line, watching the house." Earl didn't turn around. "I know. I felt it. Earl, we need to talk about this. Really talk. I can't help you if I don't understand what's going on." For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, carrying decades of weight. "After breakfast, we'll drive into town, talk to some folks. Maybe then you'll understand that this ain't just an old man's imagination playing tricks." The drive into Chester took 20 minutes on the winding river road. Earl sat in the passenger seat of my truck, his cane between his knees, staring out at the muddy waters of the Mississippi as we crossed the bridge. He seemed smaller somehow, diminished, and I realized with a pang of guilt that I'd been so focused on my own fear that I hadn't really looked at him. The fear was still there in his eyes, but underneath it was something worse. Exhaustion and a kind of terrible resignation. Our first stop was the feed store on the outskirts of town, a ramshackle building that had been selling grain and farm supplies since before Earl was born. The owner, a heavy-set man named Bud Merkel, was sitting behind the counter reading a worn paperback when we walked in. His face lit up when he saw Earl. "Well, I'll be damned. Earl Thornwood in the flesh. Heard you've been having some trouble out on the farm." "You could say that." Earl leaned on his cane, and I saw Bud's expression shift as he took in how tired and worn my grandfather looked. "Toby here's visiting from Pittsburgh. He found something in the bottomland yesterday. Bones. Piled up neat as you please. Some of them belong to my dogs." Bud's face went carefully blank. "That's so." "Sheriff's office came out. They found Jimmy Henderson's belt in the pile." Something flickered in Bud's eyes, recognition maybe, or fear, but it was gone before I could be sure. "Jimmy Henderson, that's a damn shame. Mary's been beside herself since he went missing." I stepped forward, tired of dancing around the subject. "Mr. Merkel, have you seen anything strange lately? Heard anything?" "My grandfather's dogs ran off 3 nights ago all at once, like something scared them bad enough to override every instinct they had. And I found tracks down by the river, big tracks, bigger than any dog or wolf I've ever seen. Tracks that—" I hesitated, aware of how crazy this was going to sound. Tracks that changed from 4 feet to 2. Bud's face went very still. He looked at Earl, then back at me, and I saw something pass between them. Some silent communication that I wasn't privy to. "I don't know nothing about any tracks," Bud said finally. "But I'll tell you this, there's been a lot of strange happenings along the river these past few weeks. Livestock going missing, mostly. The Hendersons lost 3 calves. The Mackenzie place upriver. They had 6 sheep just vanish one night. No bodies, no blood, nothing. And the Peterson farm on the other side of town, they found their barn cat nailed to the side of the building, gutted clean." "Jesus," I breathed. "That ain't something an animal does," Bud continued. "That's something with hands, something that knows what it's doing." He looked at Earl again. "You told him yet? About 59? Earl shook his head. "Getting there." "Well, you better get there quick. Whatever's happening, it's building towards something. I can feel it." Bud leaned forward, lowering his voice, even though we were alone in the store. "My granddaddy used to tell stories. Stories about something that lived in the river. Something old. Said it slept for decades, sometimes generations, but when it woke up..." He trailed off, shook his head. "I always thought it was just talk. Old man's nonsense, but these past few weeks, I ain't so sure anymore." We talked for a while longer, but Bud didn't have any more concrete information, just feelings, impressions, the kind of rural unease that builds when too many strange things happen in too short a time. When we left, Earl directed me to the county library, a small brick building on Main Street that had been converted from a bank sometime in the 60s. The librarian, a thin woman with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes behind cat-eye glasses, recognized Earl immediately. "Mr. Thornwood. Haven't seen you in here since you were researching your family history. That was, 10 years ago now?" 12, Earl said. "My grandson Toby here is looking into some local history, stories about the river, anything you might have on unusual events going back 100 years or so." The librarian, her name tag read Helen Marsh, gave us both a long, appraising look. "Unusual events? You mean the disappearances?" "Among other things." She nodded slowly, as if coming to some internal decision. Follow me." She led us to a back room I hadn't known existed, a small archive filled with filing cabinets and boxes of old newspapers and photographs. For the next 2 hours, she helped us dig through the collection, pulling out articles and documents that painted a picture I didn't want to see. The disappearances went back further than I could have imagined. October 1922. 3 farmhands vanished from a property south of Chester. Their bodies never found. October 1891. A family of 5. Settlers who'd built a cabin on the riverbank. Simply gone one morning, their breakfast still on the table. October 1858. A steamboat called the River Queen ran aground on a sandbar near what would become Earl's farm, and when rescuers arrived the next morning, the crew of 12 had vanished, with only strange tracks in the mud to mark their passing. And then there were the sightings. Newspaper articles from 1922 and 1891, faded and yellowed, describing a creature of uncommon size and ferocity seen along the riverbank. Eyewitness accounts of something that walked on 2 legs but was most assuredly not a man. A sketch from 1891, crude but unmistakable. A figure with the body of a man and the head of a wolf, standing on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi. The local tribes had stories about it, Helen said quietly, watching me flip through the documents. The Osage, the Alini, others. They called it different names, but the descriptions were always the same. Something that came from the river. Something that slept for long years and then woke hungry. She paused. They also said it was smart. Smarter than any animal, that it chose its prey carefully, and that trying to hunt it was suicide. I looked at Earl. He was staring at the sketch from 1891, his face gray. "You saw it," I said, "in 1959. What happened?" He didn't answer for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting a faded photograph that he handed to me. It showed 3 young men in their 20s, standing by a john boat on the riverbank. I recognized Earl immediately, younger, stronger, but with the same steady eyes. The other 2 men were strangers. "That's Billy Carver," Earl said, pointing to the tall one on the left. "Sheriff Carver's granddaddy. And that's Tommy Klein. Used to run the hardware store before he passed." He took a breath. "We were catfishing the night it happened. October, same as now. Full moon, water smooth as glass. We heard something moving through the trees on the bank, something big, and Billy shined his flashlight toward the sound." He stopped, and I saw his hands trembling. "What did you see, Earl?" "Eyes," he said. "Eyes just like you described. Amber gold reflecting the light, but that ain't all. We saw the shape behind them, just for a second, before it moved back into the shadows. But a second was enough." He looked at me, and there were tears in his eyes. "Tommy never recovered. Spent the rest of his life drinking, trying to forget what he saw. Billy pretended it never happened, buried it so deep even his kids don't know. And me?" He shook his head. "I stayed. Stayed on the farm, stayed near the river, because I figured if it ever came back, someone ought to be here. Someone who knew what it was, who could warn people. Earl, It let us go that night," he continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "It could have taken us easy. We were sitting ducks in that boat, but it just watched, and then slipped back into the river like it had never been there at all. I've spent 60 years trying to understand why it killed some folks and let others live, what it wanted, what it was." He met my eyes. "I still don't know, but I know this. It's back now, and it's different this time. More active, more bold. Those bones you found, the dogs, the livestock, it's building up to something. I can feel it in my bones. We drove back to the farm in silence. The sun was setting by the time we turned onto the gravel road, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that should have been beautiful, but instead looked like the river was bleeding. I parked in the yard and sat there for a moment, trying to process everything I'd learned. Rational explanations. I'd gone into town looking for rational explanations, and instead I'd found newspaper clippings and photographs and a history of horror stretching back more than a century. I'd found my grandfather's terror and his resignation and his fierce, quiet determination to protect me from something he knew I couldn't fight. I'd found a shape in the darkness that had haunted this land since before the settlers came, something old and patient and hungry. But I still couldn't believe it. Couldn't let myself believe it, because if I believed it, then everything I thought I knew about the world was wrong. And that was a door I wasn't ready to open. I'm going to set up some cameras, I told Earl as we walked toward the house. Trail cams, the kind hunters use. If something's out there, I want to get it on film, real evidence, something I can take to the authorities. Earl just nodded, his face unreadable. Do what you need to do, boy. Just don't go near the river after dark. Promise me that? I promised. I spent the next hour driving into Chester to buy supplies. 2 high-quality trail cameras with infrared capability, extra batteries, SD cards. The young clerk at the sporting goods store gave me a curious look when I explained what I wanted them for. Game cameras? This time of year? Deer season don't start for another month. Not hunting deer, I said. Something's been getting into my grandfather's livestock. I want to know what. The clerk nodded, losing interest. We've had a lot of farmers in here lately saying the same thing. Must be a big coyote pack moving through the area. I didn't bother correcting him. Back at the farm, I set up the cameras while there was still light. One I mounted on the tobacco barn, aimed at the tree line by the river. The other I placed in a cottonwood tree at the edge of the bottomland, overlooking the path to the clearing where I'd found the bones. If anything came through either area, I'd know about it. Dinner was quiet. Earl picked at his food, and I found I didn't have much appetite either. Afterward, we sat on the porch, the way we always had, but there was no whiskey this time, and we didn't watch the river. We watched the tree line, and the shadows gathering beneath the trees, and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. You should go back to Pittsburgh, Earl said suddenly. First thing tomorrow, get back to your life. Forget about all this. I'm not leaving you here alone. I've been alone on this farm for 40 years, boy. I can handle... No. I turned to look at him, and something in my face must have shown how serious I was, because he fell silent. I don't know what's out there, Earl. I don't know if it's what you think it is or something else, or just some crazy person with a wolf mask and too much time on their hands. But I'm not leaving you alone with it. Not a chance. He stared at me for a long moment, and then something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, or gratitude, or just the bone-deep comfort of not having to face the darkness alone. Stubborn as your daddy, he said finally. He'd be proud of you. We went inside shortly after that, locking doors that had never been locked in my memory, checking windows that had always stood open on October nights. Earl went to his room on the first floor, and I climbed the stairs to mine, pausing at my window to look out at the night. The moon was rising nearly full, casting silver light across the fields. The river was a black ribbon in the distance, and the tree line at the edge of the yard was a wall of shadow, impenetrable and silent. I stood there for a long time, watching for movement, watching for those amber gold eyes. Nothing. Maybe it had moved on, I told myself. Maybe it had taken what it wanted and gone back to wherever it came from. Maybe the crisis was over and all that remained was the aftermath. Grief for the dogs, paperwork for the sheriff's office, a story that no one would ever believe. I almost convinced myself. Almost. Then I saw the eyes. They appeared in the tree line at the far end of the yard, maybe 50 yards from the house, glowing with that same terrible amber gold light. They were at shoulder height on a standing man, just like before, and they were fixed on my window with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The fear was like ice water in my veins, freezing me in place, and all I could do was stare at those eyes as they stared back at me. There was intelligence there, cold and patient and ancient. It knew I was watching. It knew I was afraid. And it didn't care. For what felt like an eternity, we held that silent standoff. The thing in the darkness and the man at the window, predator and prey, locked in a moment that stretched until I thought I would scream from the tension. Then the eyes moved. Not toward the house, toward the tobacco barn. I watched, frozen as they drifted through the tree line, tracking along the edge of the yard. They never blinked, never wavered, never looked away from their path. And as they moved, I caught glimpses of the shape behind them. Dark against dark, a shadow moving through shadows, but massive, impossibly massive. The proportions were wrong, the silhouette was wrong, everything about it was wrong in ways my mind couldn't quite process. It reached the corner of the tobacco barn and stopped. The eyes turned toward me again, catching the moonlight, and I swear to God they were laughing. Then they vanished, winking out like someone had flipped a switch, and I was alone with the night and my own pounding heart. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat in a chair by the window with the shotgun Earl had given me across my lap, watching the darkness for any sign of movement. But the eyes didn't return, and by the time the sun came up, I had almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. The next morning I checked the trail cameras. The one on the tobacco barn showed nothing but empty yard and swaying trees. But the one in the cottonwood, overlooking the path to the boned clearing, that one had captured something. I stood in the kitchen, watching the footage on my laptop while Earl looked over my shoulder. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m. The infrared image was grainy but clear enough. Something had walked down the path toward the clearing, triggering the camera's motion sensor. At first it was just a shape, four-legged, moving low to the ground, the way a dog or wolf might move through heavy brush. But then it stopped, directly in front of the camera, and rose. It rose up on its hind legs. I heard Earl's sharp intake of breath behind me, but I couldn't look away from the screen. The creature, and it was a creature, there was no pretending otherwise, turned toward the camera as if it knew it was being watched. The image showed it from the chest up, the infrared rendering it in shades of gray and white. It had the head of a wolf. That was the first thing I registered. The elongated snout, the pointed ears, the jaws that hung slightly open to reveal rows of teeth that gleamed even in the colorless image. but the head was attached to a neck that was too long, too muscular, and below that were shoulders that belonged on a linebacker, massive and broad. And the hands. God help me, the hands. They weren't paws. They were hands. Long, jointed fingers tipped with curved claws that looked sharp enough to gut a man with a single swipe. They hung at its sides as it stared at the camera, and I could see them flexing, the claws extending and retracting like a cat's. Then it moved closer to the camera, close enough that its face filled the entire frame. I could see the texture of its fur now, coarse and matted, slicked with something that might have been river water or blood. I could see the eyes catching the infrared light, gleaming with that same amber gold glow I'd seen from my window. And I could see its expression. It was grinning, not snarling, not threatening, not displaying teeth the way a predator might to warn off a rival. It was grinning, the corners of its muzzle pulled back in an expression that was horribly, unmistakably human. An expression that said, I know you're watching. I know you're scared, and I'm enjoying it. Then its ears swiveled toward some sound off camera, and the grin faded. It turned its head, listening to something I couldn't hear, and then it dropped back to all fours and vanished from the frame with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something that size. The footage ended. The last frame showed nothing but empty trees and darkness. I sat there for a long time staring at the frozen image on the screen. Behind me, Earl sank into a chair, and I heard him whisper something under his breath. A prayer, maybe, or a curse. That's it, I said. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, flat and distant. That's what you saw in 1959. Yes, Earl said. That's the Riverman. I turned to look at him. What is it? What the hell is it, Earl? He shook his head slowly. I don't know. I've spent 60 years trying to find an answer, and I don't know. Something old, something that was here before us, maybe before anything. The Osage called it a skinwalker, but that ain't quite right. Skinwalkers are men who become monsters. This thing, he trailed off, his eyes distant. This thing was never a man. I don't think it was ever anything we have a word for. I looked back at the laptop screen, at the frozen image of that terrible grinning face. It's real. It's actually real. Yes. And it's hunting, right now, right here. Yes. I stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over my chair. The fear was still there, cold and heavy in my chest, but alongside it was something else. Anger. Anger at this thing that had killed my grandfather's dogs, that had terrorized the old man I loved most in the world, that had been stalking these lands for generations, while people vanished and no one did anything about it. Okay, I said. Okay. We know what we're dealing with now. We have proof. We have footage. We can take this to the authorities, the state police, the FBI. Toby. Earl's voice was gentle, but there was iron in it. Who's going to believe us? A video of something in the dark? They'll say it's a hoax, a costume, some kind of viral marketing stunt. Even if they believe it, what are they going to do? Send a hunting party out into the bottomland? Hunt something that's been picking off people for more than a century without ever being caught or killed? Then what do? I demanded. Sit here and wait for it to come for us? No. Earl pushed himself to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. We stay alert. We stay careful. We don't go near the river after dark, and we don't give it a reason to come close to the house. Whatever it is, however long it's been here, it's never attacked someone in their own home. It hunts in the wild, in the dark, in the spaces between where people live. As long as we stay inside at night, as long as we don't go looking for trouble. It'll just keep hunting other people, I finished for him. Other farms, other families. Earl met my eyes, and I saw the weight of 60 years in his gaze. I know. I've lived with that knowledge for most of my life. There's nothing I can do about it, Toby. Nothing any of us can do. It's been here longer than we have, and it'll be here long after we're gone. All we can do is survive. I wanted to argue. I wanted to rage against the unfairness of it, the helplessness, the idea that something monstrous could prowl the land I loved, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But looking at my grandfather's face, seeing the decades of fear and resignation and hard-won acceptance written in every line, I couldn't find the words. Instead, I saved the video file to 3 different places: my laptop, a USB drive, and the cloud. If nothing else, there would be a record. There would be proof for whatever good it might do. The day passed slowly. I spent most of it walking the property in the daylight, looking for tracks, for signs, for anything that might help me understand what we were dealing with. I found more of those impossible prints near the riverbank, fresh ones that had been made sometime during the night. They led down to the water's edge and then vanished, as if whatever had made them had simply walked into the Mississippi and disappeared. The river itself looked wrong again, the way it had when I'd first arrived. The water seemed thicker, darker, and the usual traffic of barges and pleasure boats was nowhere to be seen. Even the birds were absent. No herons stalking the shallows, no eagles circling overhead, no crows arguing in the trees. The whole bottomland felt held breath, waiting. I walked back to the house as the sun began to set, my mind churning with questions I couldn't answer. What did it want? Why was it here? Why did it kill some people and let others live? Earl and his friends had seen it in 1959, had been sitting ducks in their little boat, and it had just watched them before slipping back into the river. But Jimmy Henderson, the fisherman whose belt I'd found in the bone pile, he hadn't been so lucky. Neither had the dogs, or the livestock, or the countless others who had vanished over the years. What made the difference? What was the pattern? I didn't have answers I wasn't sure I ever would. That evening I made Earl promise to stay inside after dark, and I took up my position by the window again. The shotgun was loaded with slugs, and I had a flashlight within easy reach, and I told myself that I was ready for whatever came. I wasn't. The sun set in a blaze of red and gold, and the shadows crept across the fields like rising water. The tree line went dark first, then the tobacco barns, then the yard itself, until only the porch light pushed back against the night. I sat in my chair by the window, watching, waiting. The eyes didn't appear until nearly midnight. They were closer this time, much closer. Not at the edge of the tree line, but at the edge of the yard, maybe 20 yards from the house. They floated in the darkness like twin flames, that terrible amber gold glow that had haunted my dreams for 2 nights now. I gripped the shotgun, my hands slick with sweat, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The eyes were fixed on me. I knew they were, even though I couldn't make out anything of the shape behind them. They watched me the way a cat watches a mouse, patient and predatory and utterly without fear. Then they moved. Not closer, sideways. They drifted along the edge of the yard, tracking toward the back of the house, toward the tobacco barns, toward the place where I'd set up my trail camera. I realized what it was doing. It was circling, probing our defenses, looking for weaknesses, learning the layout of the property. It wasn't attacking. Not yet. It was hunting in the truest sense of the word, gathering information, preparing for the moment when it would make its move. I stood up, moving to the window, pressing my face against the glass to try to track its movement. The eyes had disappeared behind the corner of the house now, blocked from my view by the angle. But I could feel it out there, somewhere in the darkness, watching and waiting. The floodlights, I thought. Earl had mentioned something about installing floodlights, about wanting to push back the darkness around the house. Why hadn't he done it? Why had he let the night have so much territory? Because it wouldn't have mattered, I realized. Because whatever was out there wasn't afraid of light, wasn't afraid of anything. The light might reveal it, but it wouldn't stop it. Nothing would stop it. I stood at the window for hours, tracking the occasional glimpse of those eyes as they circled the property. They never came closer than 20 yards, never made any move toward the house, but they were always there, always watching. When dawn finally came and the eyes disappeared with the darkness, I realized I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the shotgun. Earl found me slumped in my chair, the gun across my lap, staring at nothing. "You look like hell," he said quietly. "It was out there all night, circling, watching." He nodded, unsurprised. "It's learning, figuring out what we are, what we do. It'll keep watching until it's ready." "Ready for what?" Earl didn't answer. He didn't have to. That afternoon, I drove into town again and bought every floodlight the hardware store had. I spent the rest of the daylight hours mounting them on the house, the tobacco barns, the outbuildings, anywhere I could find an outlet and a mounting point. By the time I was finished, the property was ringed with lights, dozens of them, enough to push back the darkness in every direction. It wasn't enough. I knew it wasn't enough. But I had to do something. I couldn't just sit and wait for whatever was coming. The sun set and I turned on the lights. The yard blazed like a stadium, harsh and artificial and almost blinding. I stood on the porch, squinting into the glare, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. For a while there was nothing. The lights seemed to hold the night at bay, creating an island of false daylight in the middle of the darkness. Maybe it had worked. Maybe the creature didn't like the light after all, would stay in the shadows where it belonged. Then I saw it, not the eyes this time, the shape. It was standing on the levee, silhouetted against the orange glow of the sky where the last light of sunset still lingered. 7 feet tall, at least. Shoulders impossibly broad. A head that was the wrong shape. Too elongated, too heavy. It stood on 2 legs, but its proportions were all wrong. Arms too long. Legs bent at angles that made no anatomical sense. It was watching the house, watching the lights, watching me. And it didn't look afraid. It looked amused. I raised the shotgun, sighting down the barrel at that distant shape. My hands were steady now, steadier than they had any right to be. The range was too far for an accurate shot, but I didn't care. I wanted it to know I would fight. I wanted it to understand that we weren't just prey, weren't just waiting to be picked off. For a long moment we stood there, the thing on the levee and the man on the porch, locked in another silent standoff. Then a barge horn sounded from somewhere upriver, echoing across the water, and the creature dropped to all fours with a movement that was horribly, impossibly fluid. It vanished down the riverbank, moving so fast it was there 1 second and gone the next. I lowered the shotgun, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline was draining out of me, leaving behind nothing but fear and doubt and a growing certainty that I was in over my head. "It's real," I whispered to myself. "It's actually real." But even as I said it, a part of me was still trying to deny what I'd seen, still trying to find some rational explanation, some way to make sense of something that defied all sense. A person in a costume, maybe, an elaborate hoax, a trick of the light. But I'd seen the way it moved. I'd seen the proportions that no costume could replicate, the speed that no human could match. I'd seen its silhouette against the dying light of day, and I knew in my bones that whatever it wasn't human. And it wasn't going away. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. Earl was sitting at the kitchen table, the same cold coffee in front of him, the same tired resignation in his eyes. Saw it on the levee, I said, full shape. It's big, Earl. Bigger than I thought. He nodded. It's been getting bolder. Coming closer each time. That's what it did in 59 too. Circled and watched for days. Getting a little closer each night until finally he trailed off, shaking his head. But it never attacked. Not that time. It just watched and then it was gone. Went back to wherever it came from. Slept for 60 years. What's different now? Why is it coming back? I don't know. Maybe nothing's different. Maybe this is just its time to wake up, to hunt. Maybe he hesitated. Maybe it's hungry. I sat down across from him, the shotgun resting against my knee. We can't just wait for it to decide we're on the menu. There has to be something we can do. Like what? Call the National Guard? Tell them there's a werewolf in the bottomland? Earl laughed. But there was no humor in it. This thing has been hunting these lands since before there was a county sheriff, since before there was an America. It's older than us, smarter than us, and tougher than anything we could throw at it. The best we can hope for is that it gets what it came for and goes back to sleep. Gets what it came for? What does that mean? What does it want? But Earl just shook his head again. I don't know. I've never known. All I know is that it's here, and it's real, and there's nothing we can do about it. I wanted to argue. I wanted to believe there was some way to fight back, some weapon or strategy that would let us defeat this thing. But looking at my grandfather's face, seeing the decades of fear and acceptance written there, I couldn't find the strength. Instead, I sat with him in silence, listening to the night pressing against the windows, feeling the weight of something ancient and patient waiting in the darkness beyond the lights. And somewhere out there in the bottomland by the river, I knew it was watching, waiting, preparing. I told myself this wasn't real. I told myself this wasn't real. I repeated it like a mantra as I sat there in Earl's kitchen, the shotgun growing heavy in my hands, the silence between us stretching into something vast and uncomfortable. I told myself that tomorrow I would wake up and everything would make sense again, that the shape on the levee had been a trick of the dying light, a shadow cast by some mundane thing, a dead tree, a pile of brush, anything but what my eyes had reported to my brain. But I didn't believe it. Not anymore. The night passed slowly, each hour dragging itself toward dawn with agonizing reluctance. Earl eventually went to bed around midnight, shuffling off to his room with a quiet, "Lock up behind me, boy," that carried the weight of 60 years of fear. I stayed at the kitchen table, watching the windows, listening to the house settle around me. The floodlights I'd installed cast their harsh glow across the yard, creating pools of brightness that only made the darkness beyond seem deeper and more threatening. Somewhere around 3 a.m, I heard the dogs. Not Earl's dogs. They were still missing, probably dead. These were dogs from neighboring farms, their barking carrying across the night air from what sounded like miles away. First one, then another, then a whole chorus of them, their voices raised in that particular frantic alarm that dogs make when something has invaded their territory, something they don't understand, something that scares them on a level deeper than training or instinct. The barking lasted for maybe 10 minutes. Then it stopped, all at once, cutting off mid-cry as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. I sat there in the kitchen and gripping the shotgun so hard my knuckles ached, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the creature to come crashing through the door or the window or the wall itself. Nothing happened. Eventually, the first gray light of dawn began seeping into the eastern sky, and I finally allowed myself to relax just a fraction. Whatever it was, it seemed to prefer the darkness. As long as I could make it to sunrise, I might be safe. That thought was the only thing that got me through the next few days. I repositioned the trail camera on the second day after seeing the silhouette, moving it from the cottonwood to a fence post near the tobacco barn where the creature had been circling. If it was getting bolder, I wanted footage from closer to the house. Earl watched me adjust the angle but said nothing. His silence was becoming oppressive, a constant reminder that he knew more than he was telling me. But every time I tried to push him for details about what had happened in 1959, he would just shake his head and change the subject. Whatever he'd seen back then, he'd buried it deep. I'd been checking the cameras every morning since I set them up. The first several days showed nothing but the usual wildlife. A possum waddling past around midnight, a family of raccoons investigating the camera itself with their clever little hands, a deer picking its way through the underbrush at dawn. Normal things, safe things. I almost started to hope that maybe the creature had moved on, that it had gotten whatever it came for and slipped back into the river to sleep for another 60 years. On the fourth day, everything changed. I retrieved the memory card just after sunrise, my fingers numb with cold and something else. Anticipation, maybe, or dread. I'd slept poorly again, my dreams haunted by golden eyes and impossible shapes. Earl was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, watching me with that tired, knowing look that had become his permanent expression. I plugged the memory card into my laptop and opened the video files. Most of them were the same as before. Small animals, wind-blown leaves, nothing interesting. But the last file, time-stamped at 2:47 a.m., was different. The footage started like all the others, showing the empty tree line in the camera's infrared glow. For maybe 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then there was movement at the edge of the frame, something large and dark sliding into view with a deliberate, almost curious motion. My heart began to pound as I watched it approach. It came right up to the camera. I watched the footage again, studying every frame of that face I'd already memorized against my will from the first camera. The same elongated snout, the same impossible hands, reaching toward the lens with almost delicate curiosity. The same river mud clinging to patchy fur. And when it looked directly into the camera, those golden eyes finding the lens with terrible precision. The same knowing smile, that grin that said it understood exactly what it was doing, that it wanted me to see. Its ears swiveled toward something off camera, and the smile widened for just a moment before it turned and vanished from the frame. I sat there staring at the frozen image on my laptop screen for a long time. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely control the trackpad. I played the footage back, Then again, then a third time, looking for something, anything, that would let me explain it away. A seam in the costume, a glitch in the recording, some sign that this was all an elaborate hoax. There was nothing. Just that face, that smile, those eyes that seemed to look right through the camera and into my soul. "Earl," I said, my voice coming out as a croak. "Earl, you need to see this." He came over slowly, reluctantly, and leaned over my shoulder to watch the footage. When the creature's face filled the screen, he made a small sound in the back of his throat. Not surprise, but recognition. Confirmation of something he'd hoped he'd never see again. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's the Riverman. It knows the camera is there. It's investigating it. I couldn't finish the sentence. "It's curious," Earl said. "It's been watching us, learning about us, figuring out what we are, what we do, what we're afraid of." He paused, then added, "It knows you're here now, Tobias. It knows you came back." The words sent ice water through my veins. I thought about all the times I'd stood on the porch, staring out at the tree line, all the times I'd walked the property, searching for the dogs, looking for tracks, trying to make sense of what was happening. I'd been looking for it, but it had been looking back. The realization that I was being watched, that I had been watched the entire time, changed something fundamental in my understanding of the situation. This wasn't a wild animal that had wandered onto the property. This wasn't some mindless predator following its instincts. This was something intelligent, patient, and calculating. It had been studying me, learning my patterns, observing my habits. I was prey. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. All my life I'd been at the top of the food chain, secure in the knowledge that as a human being I had nothing to fear from the natural world. But this thing, this Riverman, wasn't natural. It was older than me, older than Earl, older than the farm itself. It had been hunting these lands since before there was a county to have a sheriff, before there was a nation to have laws. And now it was hunting me. I closed the laptop and pushed it away, unable to look at that face anymore. Earl went back to his coffee, his expression unreadable. Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher, banishing the shadows from the yard. But I knew they would be back. They always came back. The next 3 days became a waking nightmare of paranoia and mounting dread. I started noticing things, small things, details that might have been coincidental, but that my increasingly frayed nerves interpreted as evidence of surveillance. The third morning after viewing the trail camera footage, I found tracks in the soft earth beneath my bedroom window. Massive canine prints, the same ones I'd seen by the riverbank, pressed deep into the mud as if something heavy had stood there for a long time. Stood there and looked up at the window where I slept. I measured the tracks with a tape measure from Earl's toolbox. The paw prints were nearly 10 inches long, with claw marks extending another 3 inches beyond that. But what disturbed me more than their size was their depth. Whatever had made them had been standing upright, shifting its weight from foot to foot like a man waiting in line. I imagined it out there in the darkness, looking up at my window, watching me sleep, and I had to fight down a wave of nausea that threatened to double me over. That afternoon, I went out to check on the tobacco in the upper fields, the fields that Earl still harvested, the ones far from the bottomland and the river. The work was something to do, a way to occupy my hands and my mind with something normal and productive. I needed normal. I needed to feel like The world still made sense. I was walking between the rows of plants when I noticed something hanging from one of the fence posts at the edge of the field. At first, I thought it was a piece of trash, some bit of plastic or cloth that had blown in from the road. But as I got closer, my steps slowed, and my heart began to pound. It was my Pittsburgh Pirates baseball cap, the one I'd been wearing when I first arrived at the farm, the one I'd left on the hook by the back door because I hadn't needed it in days. It was hanging on the fence post, carefully positioned so that the brim pointed toward the farmhouse. There was mud on it, the same gray river mud I'd seen on the creature's fur in the trail camera footage. And there was something else, too. Dark stains on the fabric that might have been dirt, but looked more like dried blood. I snatched the cap off the fence post and held it in my trembling hands, turning it over and over as if it might reveal some secret, some explanation for how it had gotten here. The back door had been locked. I always locked it now. There was no way anyone, anything could have gotten inside and taken this cap without my knowing. But it had. It had been in my grandfather's house, walking the same halls I walked, touching the same things I touched. While I slept, maybe. While Earl and I sat in the kitchen, telling ourselves we were safe. It had been there, and we hadn't even known. I ran back to the farmhouse, the cap clutched in my fist, and burst through the door calling for Earl. He came in from the living room, alarmed by the panic in my voice, and I shoved the cap toward him. "It was in the house," I said. "It was in the house, Earl. It took this from the hook by the door and left it in the upper field. It's playing with us. It's showing us that it can get in whenever it wants." Earl took the cap and examined it with a strange, distant expression. When he looked up at me, his eyes were older than I'd ever seen them. "It did this in '59, he said quietly. "Took little things, moved them around, let us know it was watching." He handed the cap back to me. "It's not trying to scare us, Tobias. It's not playing games, it's testing us, seeing how we react, learning what makes us afraid." "Why? Why would it do that?" Earl shook his head slowly. "Because fear makes the blood sweeter. At least that's what my daddy told me, back when his daddy told him. The Riverman feeds on fear as much as flesh. It wants us scared. It wants us knowing there's no escape, no defense, no help coming. It wants us to understand exactly what's going to happen before it happens." I stared at him, the cap dangling forgotten from my hand. "So what do we do? How do we fight something like that?" But Earl just turned and walked back to the living room, his shoulders slumped with a defeat that went beyond exhaustion. "We don't," he said over his shoulder. "We survive if we're lucky. We don't fight." I wanted to argue. I wanted to scream at him that there had to be something we could do, some way to defend ourselves against this thing. But the words died in my throat as I remembered that face on the trail camera footage. That knowing smile, those eyes that held an intelligence older and deeper than anything human. What could we possibly do against something like that? The next day I tried to get help. I drove into town and went to the sheriff's office, determined to make someone listen, to show them the footage from the trail camera, to make them understand that something terrible was happening on my grandfather's farm. Sheriff Patterson was a big man in his 50s, red-faced and friendly in that way small-town law enforcement sometimes cultivates. He listened to my story with an expression of polite skepticism that gradually shaded into outright disbelief. When I pulled out my laptop and showed him the footage, he watched it in silence, his thick fingers drumming on his desk. "That's a good costume," he said when it was over. "Somebody's playing tricks on you, Tobias. Probably some kids from the high school. They do this kind of thing every October, you know, Halloween coming up and all." "It's not a costume," I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "Look at the way it moves. Look at its hands. No costume could do that." Patterson shrugged. "Special effects these days can do pretty much anything. You seen those YouTube videos? Folks making fake Bigfoot sightings, fake UFOs, all kinds of stuff. Probably someone trying to go viral or something." He leaned back in his chair, his manner becoming more dismissive. "Look, your granddaddy's been spinning stories about the Riverman for as long as I've been wearing this badge. His daddy spun the same stories, and his daddy before that. It's a local legend. Tobias. Like the Headless Horseman or the Jersey Devil. Doesn't mean it's real." "What about the missing livestock? You told me yourself that other farms upriver have been losing animals." "Coyotes," Patterson said firmly. "Maybe a bear that wandered down from the hills. We got wildlife officers looking into it. Nothing supernatural about it." He stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "You want my advice? Get some sleep. Spend less time staring at security cameras in the middle of the night. Take your granddaddy to see a doctor. At his age, sometimes the mind starts playing tricks. There's nothing out there but the usual critters, and the usual critters are plenty dangerous enough without making up monsters." I left the sheriff's office feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Patterson hadn't believed me, hadn't even seriously considered believing me. And why would he? If I hadn't seen the thing with my own eyes, if I hadn't watched it move with that horrible liquid grace, I wouldn't have believed it either. But I had seen it. And I knew with a certainty that went beyond logic or evidence that it was real. I made a few more attempts to get help over the following days. I called the Missouri Department of Conservation and reported a large predator on the property. They promised to send someone out to take a look, but warned me it might be a few weeks due to understaffing. I reached out to a friend from my Pittsburgh construction crew, a guy named Mike, who'd always been interested in cryptids and paranormal stuff. He listened to my story with what sounded like genuine interest, but lived 800 miles away and couldn't exactly drop everything to come investigate. I even tried contacting a professor at Southeast Missouri State University who I'd read had done research on local folklore. She never returned my emails. I was alone, completely, utterly alone, except for Earl, who had already resigned himself to whatever fate the Riverman intended for us. No help was coming. No one believed me. And every night the creature grew bolder. I started seeing signs of its presence everywhere. Tracks around the chicken coop, though we didn't have chickens anymore. Scratch marks on the doors of the outbuildings. Deep gouges in the wood that could only have been made by those curved claws I'd seen in the footage. One morning I found a dead possum on the front porch, its belly opened and its organs arranged in a neat row on the welcome mat. A display, a message, a warning. The creature was closing in. I stopped sleeping at night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, that smile, those hands with their impossible fingers and their sickle claws. Instead, I dozed during the day, catching an hour here and there while the sun was high, and the world felt marginally safer. Earl started doing the same, and we fell into a rhythm of mutual vigilance, one of us always awake while the other rested. But even during the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was constant now, a pressure at the back of my skull that never went away. I would be walking through the house and suddenly feel certain that something was looking in through the window behind me. I would be sitting on the porch and sense movement at the edge of my vision, only to turn and find nothing there. The creature was out there, always out there, patient and watchful and waiting for the moment to strike. The night before everything came to a head, I made one last attempt to prepare. I went through the house and gathered every potential weapon I could find. The shotgun, of course, but also a hunting rifle that had belonged to Earl's father, a machete from the tool shed, a can of bear spray I'd picked up at the sporting goods store in town. I loaded everything into the old tobacco barn, thinking that if worse came to worst, I could make a stand there. The barn had solid walls, a heavy door, and only a few windows. It was as defensible as anything on the property. I also brought in a diesel lantern, the old-fashioned kind with a glass reservoir and a wick, because the barn's electrical wiring was ancient and unreliable. And I brought in a hay hook, a wicked curved tool used for moving bales, with a sharp point and a sturdy wooden handle. If the creature got close enough, if the guns weren't enough, I wanted something I could use in hand-to-hand combat. Earl watched me make these preparations but didn't say anything. His silence had become complete now, a wall between us that I couldn't breach. Whatever was going to happen, he had accepted it. He was ready to die. I wasn't. I wasn't ready to die, and I wasn't ready to let that thing take my grandfather from me. I'd lost my parents when I was a child, lost them in a car accident that still haunted my dreams. Earl had raised me, loved me, made me the man I was. I wasn't going to let some monster from the Mississippi drag him into the darkness. But as I lay awake, that last night before the confrontation, listening to the silence press against the windows, feeling the weight of something ancient and hungry watching from the tree line, I wondered if I had any choice in the matter at all. The creature had been patient. It had been careful. It had learned everything it needed to know about us, our routines, our fears, our weaknesses. And now, with the October moon waxing toward full and the nights growing longer, I could feel its patience running out. It was ready to hunt, and there was nowhere left to run. I got up from the couch, where I'd been pretending to rest, and went to stand at the kitchen window, looking out at the floodlit yard and the darkness beyond. The Mississippi was out there somewhere, sliding past in its eternal journey toward the Gulf. The bottomland was out there with its unharvested tobacco and its ancient trees and its secrets. And the creature was out there, watching me through eyes that had watched countless generations of my family, waiting for the moment to make its move. I checked the shotgun for the 100th time. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. I checked on Earl, who was dozing in his recliner with one hand resting on the rifle across his lap. And then I sat down at the kitchen table and watched the night crawl toward dawn, knowing in my bones that tomorrow would bring the reckoning. Whatever was coming, I would face it. Not because I was brave, I wasn't. Not because I had a plan, I didn't. But because there was no other choice. The creature had made sure of that. It had isolated me, stripped away my support, shown me exactly how helpless I was. Now it was time to see if I had anything left to fight with. The morning brought no relief, only the grim certainty that whatever had been building over the past week was finally coming to a head. The sky was the color of old pewter, clouds hanging low and heavy over the bottomland, and the air had that electric quality that presaged storms. I could feel it in my bones, in the way my skin prickled and my hair stood on end. Something was going to break today. Something was going to shatter. Earl was awake when I came downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, his face carved with deep lines that hadn't been there a week ago, his eyes hollow and distant. When he looked up at me, I saw resignation in those eyes, acceptance. He'd made his peace with whatever was coming. I hadn't. We sat together in silence as the morning crawled toward noon, watching the sky darken and the wind pick up. Earl's old hound, the only dog that hadn't run off with the others, a half-deaf mutt named Biscuit, who'd been too arthritic to join the pack, was restless, pacing the house and whining at the windows. He could feel it too. Whatever was out there in the bottomland, whatever had been watching us and waiting, it was close now, closer than it had ever been. The first drops of rain hit the windows around 2 o'clock, fat and heavy, and within minutes, the sky had opened up in a deluge that turned the world beyond the glass into a gray blur. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and lightning flickered over the river. The power went out at 3, plunging the house into premature twilight, and I scrambled to light the oil lamps Earl kept for exactly this purpose. By the time night fell, the storm had settled into a steady downpour, the kind that could last for hours. The floodlights were dead without power, and the darkness beyond the windows was absolute. I couldn't see the tree line anymore, couldn't see the barn, couldn't see anything except the rain streaking down the glass, and my own reflection staring back at me, hollow-eyed and terrified. That's when Biscuit went crazy. He started barking with a ferocity I'd never heard from the old dog, that deep, frenzied sound that means something seriously wrong. He was facing the back door, the one that led toward the tobacco barn, and his hackles were raised so high he looked like he'd been electrified. The barking shifted to a growl deep in his chest, then to whimpering, his tail tucked between his legs, even as he kept his eyes fixed on that door. Something was out there. Something was close. Earl grabbed the rifle and I grabbed the shotgun. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Whatever was coming, we'd face it together. And that was all that mattered. The scratching started on the back door. Long, slow scratches that traced down the wood with terrible deliberation. Biscuit went silent all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch, and in that sudden quiet I could hear the scratching clearly. It was rhythmic, almost musical, like claws tapping out a pattern that meant something, a message I couldn't read. Then the window beside the door shattered. I saw the hand first. That impossible hand, with its fingers like twisted roots and its claws like curved sickles. It reached through the broken glass as if the shards meant nothing, rain and blood dripping from its gray-black fur, and it groped for the lock on the door. I raised the shotgun and fired. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. The hand jerked back through the window, and I heard something outside scream. The sound was wrong in ways I can't describe. Too high and too low at the same time, human and animal and something older than either. It went through me like a knife, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except stand there with the shotgun in my hands and the echo of that scream ringing in my ears. Earl grabbed my arm. His grip was stronger than I would have expected from a man his age, and his eyes were clear for the first time in days. "The barn," he said. "We can defend the barn. It was the most he'd spoken in a week, and he was right. The house was compromised now, the window broken, the darkness pressing in through the gap. The barn had solid walls, a heavy door, limited points of entry. If we could get there, if we could make it through the rain and the dark, we might have a chance. We ran. The rain hit us like a wall of water the moment we stepped outside. I couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction, and the darkness was absolute. The kind of black that swallows everything. I had the shotgun in one hand and a flashlight in the other, its beam cutting weakly through the downpour. Earl was behind me, the rifle clutched to his chest, his breathing ragged but his steps steady. The barn was 100 yards from the house. I'd walked that distance 1,000 times in my life, but tonight it felt like miles. Every step was an act of will, fighting the mud that sucked at my boots, fighting the rain that blinded me, fighting the terror that screamed at me to turn back, to hide, to curl up in a ball and hope the monster would pass me by. It didn't pass me by. I saw the eyes first. 2 points of amber gold light, low to the ground, moving through the rain about 30 feet to my left. They were watching me, tracking me, following. I swept the flashlight toward them and caught a glimpse of something massive and low-slung, something that moved on 4 legs with a fluid, predatory grace that made my stomach turn. Then the lights went out and all I could see was the rain. Keep moving, I told myself. Don't stop. Don't look. Just keep moving. The barn loomed out of the darkness like a ship appearing from fog. I grabbed the door and hauled it open, shoving Earl inside before following and slamming it shut behind us. There was a heavy wooden beam that served as a lock, and I dropped it into the brackets with shaking hands, sealing us in. For a moment there was only silence. The rain drummed on the roof, steady and relentless, and my breathing sounded harsh and ragged in my own ears. Earl was leaning against one of the support beams, his face gray and his chest heaving. The rifle hung limp in his hands. I fumbled for the light switch before remembering the power was out. But I'd brought the diesel lantern here, hadn't I? I'd prepared. I'd planned. I stumbled through the darkness until I found it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely strike the match. The flame caught, and warm light flooded the barn, pushing back the shadows. We were surrounded by dried tobacco leaves. They hung from the rafters in long rows, their smell sweet and earthy and familiar, a scent I'd known since childhood. The hay hook was where I'd left it, propped against the wall near the door. The machete was there too, and the bear spray, and all the other weapons I'd gathered in my desperate attempt to prepare for something I couldn't possibly be prepared for. I reloaded the shotgun with shells from my pocket. 2 shots fired, 2 shots remaining. 4 in the gun, a handful more loose in my jacket. Not enough. Not nearly enough. That's when it hit the door. The impact shook the entire barn, rattling the walls and sending tobacco leaves drifting down from the rafters like strange brown snow. A second impact followed, harder than the first, and I saw the wooden beam bow inward under the force. Whatever was on the other side wasn't just trying to get in. It was determined. I raised the shotgun and aimed at the door, waiting for it to splinter, waiting for the creature to come through in a rush of claws and teeth and fury, but the impacts stopped. The night went silent except for the rain, and then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. It was moving around the barn. I could hear it circling, its footsteps squelching in the mud, slow and deliberate. It was looking for another way in, looking for weakness. And there were windows in this barn, small ones, high up. but large enough for something to squeeze through if it really wanted to. "I found one," Earl said, and his voice was barely a whisper. I followed his gaze to the far corner of the barn, where a thin sliver of darkness had appeared in the wall. One of the old boards had rotted through, leaving a gap maybe 6 inches wide. And as I watched, claws appeared in that gap, curling around the edge of the board, pulling. The wood groaned and splintered, and the gap widened. And through the opening, I saw it. I saw the creature fully for the first time. The lantern light caught it perfectly as it forced its way through the widening gap, illuminating every horrifying detail of its form. It was a wolf's head on a man's body, but that description doesn't begin to capture the wrongness of it. The snout was elongated, filled with teeth that were too long and too sharp, and the lips were pulled back in a grin that held intelligence, ancient, patient, hungry intelligence that had watched countless generations live and die along this river. Its eyes were that terrible amber gold, reflecting the lantern light like coins pressed over the eyes of the dead. They fixed on me with an intensity that made my soul shrink inside my body, and I felt the weight of centuries in that gaze. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't some random monster. It was old, it was powerful, and it had chosen us. The body was muscular and covered in coarse gray-black fur, matted with river mud, and something darker that might have been blood. Its arms were too long, hanging past its knees. And those hands, those impossible hands with their root-like fingers and their sickle claws, flexed and unclenched as it forced itself through the gap. The legs were wrong too, bent backward at the knee like a dog's hind legs. Yet somehow it stood upright with perfect balance, towering at least 7 feet tall in the cramped space of the barn. It smelled like the river, like mud and rotting fish and something underneath those smells, something ancient and wrong that made my stomach heave. It smelled like death, like something that had crawled out of the water 1,000 years ago and never quite dried off. And it was smiling at me. That grin, those teeth, those eyes. It was enjoying this, enjoying my terror, enjoying the hunt. I fired the shotgun. The blast caught it in the shoulder, and it staggered back a step, its grin faltering for just an instant. Dark blood welled from the wound, thick and almost black in the lantern light. But it didn't fall. It didn't run. It just looked at me with those ancient eyes, and the grin came back, wider than before. I fired again, and again, and again. Each shot hit home, tearing chunks from its flesh, spraying that dark blood across the tobacco leaves and the walls. But it kept coming. It was between us and the door now, cutting off our only escape. And Earl was behind me, and I could hear him praying under his breath, the first words of prayer I'd heard from him in my entire life. The shotgun clicked empty. I'd used all my shells, and the creature was still standing, still grinning, still coming. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just reacted, my hands moving on their own, grabbing the diesel lantern from where it sat on a crate and hurling it at the creature with every ounce of strength I had left. The lantern hit it square in the chest and shattered, spraying burning diesel across its fur. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the flames caught, racing up its body in a sheet of orange fire, and the creature screamed. That scream. I still hear it in my nightmares. 4 years later. It was human and wolf and something older than either. A sound of agony and rage that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The creature thrashed, trying to put out the flames, and its wild movement sent burning diesel spraying across the tobacco leaves. The barn went up like a bomb. Tobacco leaves are dry, especially at the end of harvest season. The flames raced along the hanging rows, jumping from leaf to leaf, and within seconds the entire ceiling was ablaze. Smoke poured down, thick and choking, and the heat was incredible, pressing against my skin like a physical force. "Get out!" I screamed at Earl, shoving him toward the door. The creature was still burning, still screaming between us and the only exit. But the flames had caught the walls now, and I could see a section near the back where the old boards were starting to give way. I grabbed the hay hook and swung it at the weakened boards with all my strength. Once, twice, 3 times. The wood splintered and fell away, revealing a gap large enough to squeeze through. Earl went first, his thin frame slipping through easily. I followed, but my jacket caught on a nail, and as I struggled to free myself, I felt my back catch fire. The pain was unimaginable. I've never felt anything like it before or since. A white, hot agony that consumed my entire being. I screamed and ripped myself free, tumbling out into the rain-soaked mud, rolling desperately to put out the flames. The rain saved me. It beat down on my burning jacket, extinguishing the fire before it could consume me completely. I lay in the mud, gasping for breath, staring up at the sky as the barn became an inferno behind me. The heat was so intense, I could feel it from 30 feet away, and the smoke rose in a towering column that must have been visible for miles. I pushed myself up on my elbows and looked back at the burning barn. And through the flames, through the smoke, I saw it. The creature stood in the heart of the inferno, its body still burning, its fur blackened and curled. But it wasn't dying. It wasn't even trying to escape. It just stood there, watching me through the flames, with those amber gold eyes, and that terrible grin never wavered. It could have come after me. It could have finished what it started. I was injured, exhausted, helpless. I had nothing left to fight with. But it didn't move. It just watched. And as I met those ancient eyes through the dancing flames, I understood something that chilled me to the bone. It was letting me go. Not because I'd beaten it, not because I'd driven it off, but because it had chosen to spare me. This was its territory, its hunting ground, and I was nothing more than a mouse that had momentarily amused it. It had shown me exactly how powerless I was, and now it was granting me my life as a final humiliation. Then it turned and walked into the flames. I watched it disappear into the heart of the fire, moving with that terrible fluid grace. And the last thing I saw before the barn collapsed in on itself was its silhouette, still standing, still grinning, swallowed by the inferno. Earl found me in the mud a few minutes later. He helped me to my feet, supporting my weight as we stumbled toward the truck. I don't remember the drive to the hospital. I don't remember much of anything from the next few hours except pain and confusion and the constant, terrible certainty that I was going to die. I didn't die. The doctors at the hospital in Cape Girardeau told me I was lucky. 2nd-degree burns on my arms and back, some smoke inhalation, nothing that wouldn't heal. They asked what happened, and I told them the lantern had fallen, that I'd knocked it over in the dark. They believed me because they wanted to believe me, because the truth was too insane to consider. The fire marshal came by the next day. He was a tired-looking man in his 50s who clearly didn't want to deal with an old tobacco barn burning down in the middle of nowhere. I told him the same story I'd told the doctors, The power outage, the diesel lantern, my own clumsiness. He nodded and wrote it all down and told me the insurance would cover the damage. He never asked about the creature-shaped outline in the ash, the spot where the fire had burned hottest and left nothing but blackened earth. If he saw it, he didn't want to know. I spent 3 days in the hospital. When they released me, Earl drove me back to the farm in silence. We didn't talk about what had happened. We never talked about it, not once, not even when I made my decision to stay. That's the thing people don't understand about surviving something like this. It doesn't end with the escape. It doesn't end when the fire goes out and the creature disappears. It follows you. It lives in you. It changes everything about who you are and how you move through the world. I sold my apartment in Pittsburgh. Just called the landlord one day and told him I wasn't coming back, that he could keep the security deposit and do whatever he wanted with my furniture. My friends, what few friends I had, tried to call for a while, but I stopped answering. What was I supposed to tell them? That I'd been attacked by a werewolf? That I'd barely escaped with my life from something that shouldn't exist? They would have thought I was crazy. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe I still am. I moved back to the farm full-time, but not because I wanted to be there. Not because I missed the land or the river or the life I'd known as a child. I moved back because I couldn't leave Earl alone. I'd seen what was out there in the bottom land, and I knew it was still there, still watching, still waiting. If I left, Earl would be alone with it. And whatever truce I'd accidentally negotiated in that burning barn, whatever mercy the creature had shown me, I didn't trust it to extend to my grandfather. I installed floodlights around every building, motion-activated solar-powered, bright enough to turn night into day. I bought 3 German shepherds from a breeder in St. Louis, big, fierce dogs, bred for protection, and trained them myself. I kept a shotgun loaded with slugs by every door, a rifle in my bedroom, a machete under my pillow. I turned the farm into a fortress, and I lived inside it like a man under siege. The bottomland fields, the ones closest to the river, I stopped harvesting them. Just let the tobacco grow wild, let the weeds take over, let the land return to whatever it had been before my family claimed it. I told myself it was too much work for 2 men. I told myself the yield wasn't worth the effort. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid. Those fields were too close to the river, too close to where I'd seen it emerge and disappear. I gave them up as a buffer zone, a no-man's land between the creature's territory and ours. An offering, in a way, payment for my life. Earl and I fell into a routine. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings, just like we always had, but we didn't watch the river anymore. We watched the tree line. We watched the shadows. We drank whiskey and listened to the night sounds, the frogs, the owls, the coyotes, and we knew that when those sounds stopped, we'd better get inside. We never talked about the creature, never discussed what it was or where it had come from or why it had chosen our farm. Earl called it the Riverman, like his father had called it, and his grandfather before that. It was just a name, a way of giving form to something that defied understanding. But sometimes late at night, when the whiskey had loosened his tongue and the darkness had settled in around us, Earl would hint at things, stories his father had told him, stories about bargains and boundaries and the price paid by those who stayed too long near the water. The Thornwoods had been on this land for 5 generations. We'd outlasted floods and droughts and the Civil War and the Great Depression. but we'd never defeated the Riverman. We just learned to live alongside it, to give it what it wanted, to hope it would leave us in peace. And when we forgot that lesson, when we grew complacent and stopped believing in the old stories, it came back to remind us. I think about that a lot, now that Earl's gone. He passed last winter peacefully in his sleep. The doctor said it was his heart, finally giving out after 87 years of hard use. I was with him when he died, holding his hand in that too bright hospital room, and his last words to me were about the land. Keep it in the family, he said. Keep the lights burning. And never go near the river at night. I buried him next to my grandmother in the little cemetery on the hill above the farm. From there you can see the whole property, the house, the outbuildings, the wild bottomland, and the Mississippi, sliding past like a ribbon of gray silk. I stood at his grave for a long time after the other mourners had left, looking out at the land he'd loved and the river he'd feared, and I felt the weight of 5 generations settling on my shoulders. I'm 38 now, 4 years since the fire, 4 years since I saw the creature fully revealed, standing in the heart of an inferno with that terrible grin on its wolf's face. And it's still out there. I hear it sometimes at night, moving through the bottomland, its footsteps squelching in the mud. I see its eyes occasionally reflecting my floodlights from the tree line. Once, just once, I found its tracks in the mud near the river. Those massive canine prints with the wrong stride. The stride of something that walks upright. But it hasn't come close to the house since the fire. It watches, but it keeps its distance. Whatever bargain we made in that burning barn, whatever truce I accidentally negotiated when I showed it that I was willing to fight, willing to burn, willing to die, rather than submit, it seems to be holding. I tell this story now because Earl is gone, and someone should know. Someone should know what lives along the Mississippi, what our family has been living with for 5 generations. The Riverman, the creature, whatever you want to call it. It's real and it's patient, and it's been here longer than we have. It was here when the first Thornwood bought this land, and it'll be here long after the last Thornwood is gone. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what it is. I've stopped trying to understand. All I know is that I'm alive, and I intend to stay that way. So I keep the lights burning. I keep the dogs close. I keep the guns loaded. And I never ever go near the river at night. Some nights I drink more than I should. Some nights I don't sleep at all. Some nights I sit on the porch and watch the bottomland and wonder if I'm crazy, if any of this really happened, if the scars on my arms and back are from some accident I've invented elaborate explanations for. But then the dogs start growling at something I can't see, or the night sounds stop all at once, or I catch a glimpse of amber gold eyes at the edge of the floodlights, and I remember that night in the barn. I remember the flames and the screaming and the grin that never wavered. I remember that the creature let me live. That's what I can't get past. Not the fear, not the scars, not the nightmares. The fact that I only survived because it chose to let me survive. Every day since then has been a gift from something that could take it back whenever it wants. Every morning I wake up in this house is borrowed time. But I'm still here. Whatever bargain I struck in that burning barn, whatever price I'm paying with my sleepless nights and my trembling hands and my inability to look at the river without feeling ice in my veins, I'm still here. Earl's gone, and the house is empty, and the nights are longer than they've ever been. But I'm still here. And somewhere out there, in the bottom land by the Riverman is watching, waiting, patient as the Mississippi itself. I don't know if it's a monster or a god or something in between. I don't know if it's evil or just indifferent, a force of nature that doesn't care about human morality any more than a flood or a fire. All I know is that it's been here forever, and it'll be here when I'm gone, and the best I can do is survive in its shadow for as long as I can. This is my story. This is what happened to me on my grandfather's farm along the Mississippi in October of a year that feels like a lifetime ago. I don't expect you to believe it. I barely believe it myself, most days. But it's true. Every word of it is true, and if you ever find yourself on a lonely stretch of the Mississippi River on a dark October night, when the moon is waxing and the frogs have gone silent and something doesn't feel quite right, remember what I told you. Remember the Riverman, and for God's sake, don't go near the water.